standing at the edge of the Bosphorus on the morning of May 29th, 1453. The city behind you has stood for over 1,000 years, survived plague, earthquake, civil war, and siege. 11 major sieges, and it is still here. The walls still rise, the churches still echo, the markets still sell silk and salted fish, and the arguments of merchants. But the army encamped outside those walls is unlike anything that has come before. 100,000 men, over 60 cannons, and a sultan who is 21 years old and has been dreaming of this city since he was a child. Welcome to Constantinople. The last day of the Roman Empire, 1453. This is the most storied city in the world. For 11 centuries, it has been the beating heart of Christian civilization, the seat of emperors, the guardian of Greek philosophy, the place where the ancient world never entirely died. Its peak, it held 500,000 people. Today, it holds perhaps 50,000, forth from plague, famine, and decades of political collapse have hollowed it out. Empire it once commanded has shrunk to this city, a strip of coastline, and almost nothing else. But it is still Constantinople, and today, you are inside it, too. To understand what is about to be lost, you first need to understand what this city was, and what it still, even in its diminished state, represented. Common image of Constantinople in 1453 is a city already in ruins, a ghost of its former glory, collapsing slowly from within. This is wrong. The city was reduced, yes, but it was not dead. Its power had always rested on 5 structural pillars, and even in this final year, those pillars still held. The first was geography. Constantinople sat on a narrow peninsula where Europe and Asia touched, controlling the only sea passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Every merchant ship moving between the two worlds had to pass through its waters. The city was, as the Greek historian Critobulus wrote, the navel of the world, not metaphorically, but commercially. Whoever held Constantinople held the toll booth of global trade. Mehmed II had grown up understanding this. He had studied it. He had maps. The second pillar was the Theodosian Walls, constructed. In the early 5th century, they remained the most formidable defensive structure in the medieval world. Triple layered, 9 meters thick at the base, flanked by towers every 50 meters. In over 1,000 years, no enemy had ever broken through them from the land side. The walls were not just stone, they were a psychological claim. They said, this city does not fall. The third pillar was knowledge. Constantinople was the archive of the ancient world. Long centuries of scholarship, the city's monasteries and imperial libraries had preserved the works of Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen in their original Greek. Kora Monastery alone held manuscripts uncopied anywhere else for 600 years. Scholars had already begun fleeing the city in the years before the siege, carrying that knowledge westward. The seeds of what we would later call the Renaissance were scattered from these walls, one leather satchel at a time. The fourth pillar was faith. Constantinople was not merely the political capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, it was the spiritual centre of Orthodox Christianity, the seat of the ecumenical patriarch, the city of Hagia Sophia, the city that believed itself to stand under the direct protection of the Virgin Mary. The city had been saved before. From the Avars, from the Arab fleets, from the Bulgars, and the faithful believed those deliverances had been miraculous. That was not entirely gone, even on the last morning. The candles were still being lit. The fifth pillar was identity. Constantinople in 1453 was the last living continuity with Rome. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos was the direct successor in an unbroken line of succession to Augustus Caesar. The people inside those walls called themselves Romans, thought of themselves as Romans. The fall of this city would not merely be the loss of a capital, to be the death of an empire that had endured in one form or another for over 2,000 years. This is what hangs in the balance on the morning of May 29th. The city you are walking through is not the Constantinople of its golden age. The grand colonnaded boulevards are overgrown in places. Entire quarters that once housed tens of thousands sit half empty. Small clusters of houses gathered around churches, separated by wild gardens, broken fountains, and fields where palaces once stood. Is a city wearing the bones of something larger than itself. But it is alive, just barely. Begin at the Golden Horn, the harbour. Even now, this is the most cosmopolitan place in the city. The docks smell of fish, rope, and hot pitch. Genoese sailors bicker with Byzantine merchants over the price of alum. 7 Venetian ships and 1 Cretan vessel are moored here, the last Western ships in the harbour. Captains have been watching the Ottoman fleet blockading the Bosphorus with the eyes of men doing careful arithmetic. Most of them will attempt to flee before dawn. Some will not make it. The Genoese district of Galata sits just across the Horn, technically outside the walls, technically neutral. Genoese had negotiated a deal with Mehmed promising non-interference, and many watched the siege from a position of studied commercial prudence. Some slipped across anyway, unwilling to stay clean while the city bled. One of them, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, took command of the land wall defence with a tactical authority that had held the Ottomans at bay for weeks. His wound before dawn, and the decision he made because of it, would decide everything. Move inland, up through the hillside districts, and the religious geography becomes visible. Hundreds of churches here, more per square kilometre than almost anywhere else on Earth. Most are underfunded, under-maintained, still beautiful. Through the Pantocrator monastery complex, and you see what slow decline looks like from the inside. Frescoes, magnificent and fading, columns cracked at the base, the monks fewer than a generation ago. Pantocrator houses the empire's most sacred relics. Fragments of the true cross, the column of the scourging, a stone from the Holy Sepulchre. Tonight, they will be carried through the streets in a candlelit procession. A last appeal to heaven here. In the northwest corner, hugging the inner walls, sits the Blackenay district, where the functioning imperial palace now stands. Not the great Byzantine palace of the old city, which has been largely abandoned for a century, but a more modest complex adjoining the walls themselves. Emperor Constantine XI is here, slept little in weeks. He has walked these walls himself, spoken to the men himself, eaten the same bread. He rejected 2 offers of safe passage. He could have left. He chose to stay. Those who have seen him in these final days describe him as calm, not with the calm of a man who has accepted death, but with the calm of a man who has accepted his role. Distinction mattered to him. Tired. Walk south through the civilian quarters. The old Venetian district, the streets running down toward the Mee, the great colonnaded avenue that had once bisected the city like a spine. And ordinary life continues in the only way it can, at the edge of catastrophe, by pretending tomorrow will come. Bread is being baked. Children are being settled. Old women are lighting candles in churches that smell of incense and cold stone. The city has been under siege for 55 days. Populations has learned to live inside a kind of suspended dread. The difference between knowing something is coming and accepting that it will come tonight. Above it all, dominating the skyline as it has for 900 years, stands Hagia Sophia. Inside, on this final night, something happens that few expected. For months, Hagia Sophia had been a wound. The site where a union with the Roman Catholic Church had been proclaimed, and which many Orthodox faithful had refused to enter, calling it apostasy, calling it betrayal. Tonight, those divisions dissolve. Orthodox and Catholic pray together in the great nave. The liturgy fills the space. 1,000 candles throw the mosaics into shimmering gold. Emperors and angels and the face of Christ staring down through the smoke. It is the last Christian service that will ever be held in this building. Whether or not those inside know that, the words they are saying are the same ones said here for 900 years. Final assault begins before dawn. Mehmed has been patient, but patience has a calculation inside it. He has attempted the walls twice in mass assaults, and twice the defenders, outnumbered 10 to 1, held, probed the walls for weaknesses, run the logistics of 100,000 men, maintained a siege for nearly 2 months. Tonight, he commits everything. The great bombard of Urban, a Hungarian engineer who first offered his services to Constantine and, receiving inadequate payment, took his skills to Mehmed instead, has spent weeks opening and reopening a breach in the Blackenay wall. Time it is broken, the defenders fill it with timber, rubble, and barrels of earth. It holds barely. Tonight, Urban fires again. The attack comes in 3 waves. First, the Bashi bazooks, poorly armed auxiliary troops, expendable by design, are sent forward to exhaust the defenders, absorb the crossbow bolts and the Greek fire and the sheer physical labour of repelling an assault. Then, the Anatolian regulars advance, better armed, better disciplined, pressing hard. For hours, the defenders hold the breach. Giovanni Giustiniani stands at its centre, directing the resistance with the precision of a man who has been doing this his whole life. Then the bolt finds him. A crossbow quarrel, or perhaps a firearm, the accounts disagree, punches through a gap in his armour near his arm. It is not a mortal wound, but it is serious. And Giustiniani calls for a gate to be opened so he can be carried back to his ship. Constantine himself is said to have gripped his arm and begged him to remain. Giustiniani did not remain. And when the men at the breach watched their commander carried away, bleeding, diminished, something in the line cracked. The Ottomans pushed through the gap, tanned. But this is not even the decisive moment. The decisive moment comes from a small postern gate in the blackened wall, the Kerkoporta, that had been left unlatched, whether through oversight, confusion, or the chaos of a 55-day siege. No one had secured it. Ottoman soldiers found it. They flooded through within minutes. Defenders on the outer walls looked behind them and saw Ottoman banners being raised inside the city. The wall had been breached from within as well as without. The fence collapsed in under an hour. Constantine XI was last seen near the gate of St. Romanos, stripped his imperial insignia. The purple cloak, the double-headed eagle, so that he could fight as a common soldier. Secretary and closest friend, George Francis, survived to write that Constantine died in the crush of that final fighting, but his body was never conclusively identified. The last Roman emperor died in the streets of his city among his men as the city fell to sounds unlike anything it had heard before. The sacking began. Mehmed had promised his army 3 days. Doors were broken open. Monastery gates gave way. The chains of captives began forming in the streets. Men, women, children, monks still holding their manuscripts. Collor Barbaro, a Venetian ship's doctor who watched from the harbour, wrote in his diary of the sounds the city made as it fell. Bells ringing until their ringers were taken, screaming from inside houses. And then, after a time, a silence that was worse than either. Hagia Sophia. The congregation was still at prayer when the doors came open. Mehmed II rode into the city on horseback in the early afternoon. He went directly to Hagia Sophia. Tintu Kritvoulis, who later wrote his biography, the Sultan dismounted at the entrance, bent down, took a handful of earth and poured it over his turban. An act of humility before God. He walked inside. He is said to have stood in silence beneath the dome and wept. He thought the church converted to a mosque immediately. Within days, a minaret was rising. The great mosaics were plastered over, preserved as it happens. Under that plaster for 500 years, until Turkish archaeologists uncovered them in the 20th century, still there now. Mehmed styled himself Kaisar-i Rum, Caesar of Rome. He was not being ironic, genuinely understood himself as the inheritor of the Roman imperial tradition, and he set about rebuilding Constantinople, which he called Constantini, as the new capital of a new empire built on the bones of the old one. He brought in craftsmen, scholars, and merchants from across his territories. He ordered forced resettlements to repopulate the emptied districts. The Grand Bazaar was established within years. Topkapi Palace rose on the hill, where the old Byzantine Acropolis had once stood, looking out over the same waters that had made this city indispensable for 11 centuries. What was lost was immense, thousands of Greek manuscripts. Texts that had survived a millennium of Byzantine custodianship were destroyed, scattered, or sold in the chaos of the weeks after the fall. The ones that had already been carried west became the intellectual kindling of the Renaissance. The Platonic Academy in Florence was seeded in part by scholars who fled Constantinople. The philosophical revolution they sparked, the recovery of Plato, the rehabilitation of Greek thought, helped produce everything from Michelangelo to Copernicus to the scientific revolution itself. The city that fell scattered its mind across Europe before it died. The Theodosian Walls still stand in Istanbul today. Can walk along them on a quiet morning, touch the stone that held for 1,000 years, and look out over a city of 15 million people living where 50,000 once made their last stand. The mosaics in Hagia Sophia have been uncovered again. They look down now on tourists and worshippers alike, golden and unbroken. The faces of emperors who believed their city would never fall still watching from the ceiling. Constantinople did not simply fall on the 29th of May, 1453. It broke apart, and in breaking, it scattered the seeds of the world that came after it.